And so to begin with, let's look at a few of the basic options here underneath of the vertex mode. And so to start at the top, the ignore backfacing function essentially is a selection tool where if we drag select an area, this is going to attempt to allow us to not select vertices behind it. Ignore backfacing can sometimes be a little bit tricky, and it may not necessarily always work the way that you want, but it has improved over the years in newer versions of 3ds Max. There is a few times where if you go into an orthographic view, such as the front view, and you drag select, that it will still select the vertices behind it, even though you have ignore backfacing turned on. But for the most part, if you switch back to perspective view with the hotkey P, it should generally work. But bear in mind that sometimes the tool can be a little bit finicky. Now the shrink tool here underneath, I'm going to start by creating a quick plane just to sample this mesh. And here under keyboard entry and the parameters, I'm going to switch this to about 20 by 20. And then convert this plane to an editable polygon object. Switch to sub-object mode. And just drag select a handful of vertices. Now what the shrink function does is it takes a selection of vertices and simply does just that, shrinks it down. It's also used in conjunction with the grow function, where if you continue to click grow, it just sort of expands that selection of vertices that you have. And so for example, let's say we were building some sort of like a mountaintop. We wanted to shrink it down and then shrink it down even more to get the top. So that's basically what the grow and the shrink tools use. Now back over here on our box, let's go ahead and delete our plane. And what I want to show you here is under preview selection. By default, it's usually turned off. If you switch this to sub-object, that simply will give you a little bit of a highlight as you sort of go through and hover your mouse over the top of the sub-object. So for example, if I am in face mode or vertex mode, you'll notice that as I hover my mouse over a vertice, the color is highlighted yellow to let me know, hey, yeah, you are actually about to select that individual vertice or that individual polygon or edge or whatever. This is useful for multiple selections where you're a little bit unsure about, you know, when you're dealing with a little bit more of a tessellated mesh that has a lot more geometry. This can be useful for ensuring that you're selecting the correct sub-objects that you need. Now under multi, what this does is this attempts to automatically detect the selection mode that you are hovering your mouse over. And so rather than toggling back and forth between vertex, edge, polygon, etc., by turning multi on, this automatically will switch back and forth between those different sub-objects as you go to select them. And so for example, if we have one vertex selected, we can quickly go in and select just the vertices. If we wanted to hover our mouse over this face, and this face, it immediately is going to switch because it assumes that where your mouse is the sub-object that you want. Fairly useful, but if you've been using Max for a while and you've got your hotkeys down pretty good, it's a little bit tricky to kind of get used to, but it is helpful for getting started with a quick and easy way to switch back and forth between your sub-object modes. We'll go ahead and leave that off, but if you decide you want to use it, that's where that tool is, right here under multi. So let's switch back to vertex mode, and moving along here under edit vertices, depending on which order that you are in, whether it's edit vertices or edit geometry, we'll start here at edit vertices. The remove function is basically going to attempt to grab any individual vertice that you have and simply remove it and then attempt to rebuild the geometry around it. Now as you can see, it has a pretty disastrous result here on this box that I have. But if we make that plane again, let's drag this guy out and we'll give it 10 by 10 this time. And we'll convert that to an editable poly. We switch back to vertex mode. Let's zoom in on it. Select the vert and hit the remove key. And that just basically attempts to, it's going to try to do its best to retain the silhouette and the shape. However, if you try to remove a vertice along a border point or an edge point, you'll notice that it will collapse that vertice, or rather that face, and basically close the edges to create that triangle along the corner here. And so for example, if we grab these and hit the remove, it's going to wipe all those guys out. You're going to want to be a little bit careful with this one because it can have some nasty results like we saw over here on this box. Now the hotkey to remove is backspace. And so if we grab them, hit backspace, we'll wipe out those verts. Now the break tool essentially will take a vertice. Let's zoom in on this one. If we have this vert and we hit the break tool, what that is going to do is it's basically going to attempt to split it in all the different angles in the direction of the adjoining polygons next to it. And so as you can see, it split that into 4 rather than the individual 1 vertice that we had. And so if we do that on an end piece here, we can assume that we're going to basically break it in a way that we're going to have 2 vertices because of this polygon and this polygon here. So if we hit break, we can move this out and then move this one out. So this is useful for splitting meshes, or if you decide that you wanted to create a detail here by splitting these vertices out. Now the extrude tool here next to it, I honestly am not going to use a whole lot here in vertex mode. What we can do is we can left click on extrude, and as you see, the tool is still highlighted here in yellow. When that happens anywhere here inside of 3ds Max, this lets you know that, hey, you have a new active tool that you are using, and when you're finished with it, you can either left click on that tool again or just simply right click anywhere in 3D space. And so if we turn this on and we attempt to extrude a vertice, when we're done, we can just right click and that'll exit out the tool. Now what this will attempt to do, if we turn this back on and we extrude this vertice here, is this will give us a additional 4 vertices around it as it takes that single vertice and kind of spikes it up along the top here in this sort of a pyramidal, triangular looking shape. Again, not excessively useful for a lot of functions that I can think of, but that's where that tool is and that's how it is used. Now the weld tool basically attempts to take any selection of vertice that you have and collapse it back into a single vertice. And so if we left click weld, you'll notice that nothing has happened. And so what we will use is here along the right hand side of the weld tool, you'll notice there's this little box here. This is basically the dialog box that pops out with it. And the reason why the weld didn't work is because it is based on this weld threshold value, which is sort of an arbitrary numeric value that is based on a distance in 3D space. And so if our value is not high enough, the weld function won't actually work. And so if you could imagine this vert being very far apart and we select all of the vertices here, what we would want to do is if we start to turn this up, you'll notice that as the verts that are closer together will slowly start snapping together, and if we crank it up all the way, that'll allow it to collapse those individual verts off to the side over here. And when we're happy with that, we can click the OK button. Now once you have your threshold set, what you can do is then you should be able to still be able to weld based on the threshold that you have. And so for example, for these verts, it looks like we need to crank it up really high. And if we just turn the threshold super high, we can hit OK. And so now all these other vertices should weld together correctly anytime that we select them and use the tool. Now we will be talking about another tool, collapse, here in just a minute, which basically does the same thing only without a threshold. But that's essentially how the weld tool works. Now the chamfer tool in vertex mode is not that helpful as well. I don't normally use this a whole lot while in vertex mode. There are other tools that are probably a better choice for it. But if we have a vertice selected, or if we just left click on the tool and we drag left click and pull those vertices down, you'll notice that it essentially kind of splits it and creates this little bit of a corner piece here along this box. And if you decide on this one that you don't want to do it manually, you can always select a vertice and then select the dialog box that pops out, and this gives you a little bit more precision using the rollout menu here like this. So once you're happy with it, you can go ahead and hit OK, and that's basically how the chamfer tool works. Now the target weld function is actually really, really handy, and sort of the quick and easy way that I always try to remind people of how to use it is to just think in your head, this vertex goes to that vertex. And so what I mean by that is once you turn the tool on, you are now in target weld mode. You're going to left click on your first vertex and then left click on your other one that you want it to go to. And so for example, you have this vertex goes to that vertex. This vertex goes to that vertex. And so it's a quick and easy way to sort of clean up your geometry when you know that you want to keep a specific point in place but connect the vertices together without using the weld tool. Because, for example, if we did that exact same thing with the weld, what it is going to do is it's going to try to average the difference between all three of these. And so when we weld them, our point is going to sort of collapse and fold somewhere here in the center, whereas a target weld will allow us to retain the outer boundary point here without using any sort of an average. And so this is a tool that even if you have some selecting target weld, you got to remember you turn the tool on in order to use it. Now the connect tool is pretty simple. What it does is it will take two vertices that you have selected and simply create an edge to bridge the distance between the two verts. And so, for example, if you've already got a triangle here, this is a three-sided triangle, the verts are already connected in every which way that's possible. But if you had a polygon, which is a four-sided piece of geometry, you could go in and you could connect the two edges together, or rather the two vertices together by an edge. This is really useful for ensuring that your topology is corrected and that you have four or three-sided polygons. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, this is essentially all the connect tool does, is just bridges that gap with an additional edge. Now remove isolated vertices. I'm not going to probably hardly ever use this. It's more of a cleanup pass that will look for vertices that are sort of floating off in 3D space. And the more comfortable you get with modeling and ensuring that you have a clean mesh, you're not really going to use this, or the remove unused map verts. Neither of these really have a lot of usage in my everyday life, but that's essentially what they do. They're going to try to clean up any additional floating verts that you have. And right now we don't have any, so the tool doesn't really have any function. So we can minimize edit vertices, and now we're going to look at the edit geometry tab. All right, so the repeat last button is essentially exactly like it sounds. We're going to go ahead and select two objects, or rather two vertices. And for example, if we, back under edit vertices, if we weld that, if we want to use the repeat last function, all we need to do is just click that, and it will do whatever the last function was that we just did. And so if we did a target weld or a chamfer or anything like that, this will immediately do that function again or turn that tool on. Now the hotkey for this is the semicolon key on your keyboard. And so this makes it a really quick and easy way to go in and rapidly redo the same operation you just did without having to go over here and click every single time. Now to showcase constraints, I'm going to go ahead and delete our plane object here, and we'll get rid of our box for now. I'm just pressing delete key, and I'm going to create a quick cylinder. Right click, convert to editable poly, and what I want to do is rotate the cylinder just slightly and switch to vertex mode, and I'll go into a sort of a left view here, and I'm just going to drag select a series of verts here. Now, where the constraint tools are the most helpful is, for example, let's say we needed to move this selection up and down these edges a little bit more accurately. If you just kind of eyeball it, you might get close, but maybe you need it to be absolutely precise and move this series of verts straight up and down along the cylinder. And so if we undo that with Control Z, I want to go ahead and select Constrain Edge. And if we do that, now when we move the mouse while holding down the left mouse button, you'll notice that it's basically attempting to follow along that edge loop. Sometimes it can be a little wonky. You'll notice the verts are kind of snapping a little bit awkwardly in some ways. But for the most part, this should retain the edge flow as needed up and down the cylinder. And so if we toggle wireframe back and forth, you'll notice that it looks like it's going good, and then it kind of snaps and corrects itself. And so you'll want to play around with that. Now face and normal constraints, these are predominantly used in a few of the other sub-object modes, and a little bit more advanced with how they work. If you turn on the face constraint and you try to do a very similar operation, for some reason vertices just don't seem to want to play nice, and it doesn't always give you the same results. So the reasoning behind using face and normal constraints is going to be with some of these other guys over here, and for the most part simply dragging and moving vertices up and down an edge constraint is the one that you're going to want to stick with. Now underneath of that, the preserve UVs, we'll get into this more when we start doing our UVW unwrapping. Essentially what this tool is intended for is if you have a series of vertices and you wanted to move them without messing up your UVs and your textures, this would attempt to allow you to do that without messing up the UVW information. Now, if we switch back to shaded mode, the create tool is generally more used for dragging and just sort of dropping in vertices. There's really not a lot of function for this because you realistically don't want to have just a bunch of random vertices floating off in 3D space. There are other tools used for creating polygons and faces, and simply just throwing down verts isn't exactly useful for much of anything unless you wanted it to be along an edge, in which case we'll talk more about that once we get to edge mode. Now the collapse tool here, this is essentially sort of the hardcore brute force version of the weld. It essentially does the exact same thing, only there is no threshold for it. You simply click the button, and as long as the two vertices are able to be collapsed together, the tool is going to work. It's going to average in between the distances between the two. Now, if I have these two vertices selected, it's not going to let me do that because there's a face and an edge here in between the two, and so we could hit collapse all day and nothing's going to happen. But if you have two vertices that go along the same edge, clicking the collapse tool is basically going to do just that, just smash the two verts together pretty much every single time. Now the attach function is available in any one of the sub-object modes, and what it does is if I throw down another box over here and convert him to an editable poly, is any mode that you are in, it doesn't matter which sub-object mode, they all have attach here on the toolbar here in the command panel, and what you can do is you simply turn on the attach and then you select another object. And this allows you to create what is basically considered to be one single static mesh. However, they are still obviously two separate elements. And I know we talked a little bit about that at first, and we'll cover that in just a little bit more. But attach, essentially all it does is just allows you to connect two types of objects together to be considered one single static mesh. And so, for example, now I can edit the vertices in both of these guys since they are considered as one after attaching them together. Now detach does basically just the opposite of that. If we grab this selection of vertices, you want to make sure that you have all of the verts selected. I won't normally use this tool in vertex mode. I'll mostly just use it in element mode. But this is how you, just to kind of help you understand what it does. If we drag select all these vertices and click detach, this will allow us to detach it as its own object. So if we wanted to call this box, press OK. We now no longer are able to adjust anything over here on this guy because he's considered a separate object. And so to do it, we would have to exit out of sub-object and then go back over to this guy and be able to manipulate him. And so detach just does basically that. It allows you to detach the two pieces together to give the selection and create the selection as its own object.